All right, so let's get it started. Welcome to the to today's live stream, which is about ARM templates basics for Microsoft Azure. My name is Marcel. I'm a Microsoft Regional Director and Azure MVP. I work a lot with customers when it comes to Azure, so I help customers to design Azure platforms, to design applications that run on Azure, to deploy those, and also to operate those. So I'm deeply in this Microsoft Azure business. And one very important aspect is managing your Azure platform with ARM templates. And this is what I will talk a little bit about today. I'm not alone. I'm together with my good friend Mirza, who will take care about all the questions in the Q&A section on the right-hand side. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A window, and Mirza will take care of the answers. So he actually has the much more complex part than I do. All right, so in the next 45 to 50 something minutes, I will talk about basics of using ARM templates. And this is important to me. It's really a beginner session. So in case you are already an ARM templates expert or experienced user of ARM templates, then you might be a little bit bored. This is really about the basics, what ARM templates are, and how they can be used to manage infrastructure and applications on the Microsoft Azure platform. So the goal is really to lift you from level 0 to level whatever 100, 150 something. All right, as I already mentioned, my name is Marcel. I'm an RD and Azure MVP. I live in Switzerland, and I also now broadcast from Switzerland now, from Bern to be precise. And as you can see, beside working with my customers, when it comes to Azure, I also do lots of workshops, speaking engagements in the communities, and also run several conferences together with my partner, where we bring together the community from Switzerland all over Europe to cover topics such as Azure or other Microsoft Cloud related topics. All right, so maybe you attended last week's live stream already. So exactly a week ago, I presented a Terraform basics for Microsoft Azure live stream. And just to give you some numbers, now it's a little bit more. I think we had 360 registrations, something from 40 countries. And we gave the opportunity to register for both live streams, and most of the people actually registered for both and are now also attending. All right, now what's in this live stream today? It's actually only two sections. So first section is a little bit, the infrastructure as code basics. So that you understand what infrastructure as code means, because this is what ARM templates is all about. And then the main part will be the second part, which is ARM templates overview, where you learn what this actually is, how it works, what happens behind the scenes if you're using ARM templates. And I will also do lots of live demos so that you can see how this really works, looks and feels on the platform. All right, so let's dive into the infrastructure as code overview section. So as the name mentions, infrastructure as code, we talk about processes and procedure to manage, which means to deploy and to manage and to operate our infrastructure components as code instead of doing it manually. So instead of deploying a virtual machine manually on the Azure platform, we do it as code. And using code gives you several advantages. And you can see them on the bullets here. I will pick like the most important ones. So if you have code that works to deploy a specific infrastructure or application component, then this code can be reused over and over again. And you can be sure that the result will always be exactly the same. So the code is repeatable. You can use it over and over again in different environments with different customers, and the result will be exactly the same all the time. Once you have your code, you also know that you will have less errors, because if the code is rock solid, if it works, if it has been quality checked, you know that it cannot fail actually, right? However, if you do stuff manually, there's lots of potentials for errors. So a second very important bullet point here. And then it's also, of course, faster, and it comes with less costs because no more manual intervention is needed. Also for highly complex deployments, you just push a button or execute one command, and in the background, everything is automatically done for you. So this is what infrastructure as code is in one slide. Now, if we dig a little bit deeper into infrastructure as code, you will learn that there's two different approaches when it comes to infrastructure as code. So the first one is the so-called imperative approach. An imperative approach means that we have kind of a script with sequential commands, which means that on line 1, we do something. If this is done, we go to line 2, and then we do something else. Which means that sequence of commands, we are using those to define what should be changed, right? So what should be done on line 1? Deploy a virtual machine. What should be done on line 2? Deploy some monitoring equipment or platform. And then step 3 or line 3 would be attach your VM to the monitoring platform. And then the script is done, right? So you instruct what should be done or what should be changed. On the other hand, we have the so-called declarative approach. And declarative means that you describe what you want. You don't instruct what should be done, but you just instruct, I want to have my platform look like this. So my application needs a storage account, it needs a virtual network, it needs a virtual machine, and so on. And the configuration needs to be like this and that. And then you have all of these declarative configuration in a file, and then you hand over this file to the Azure platform. And guess what? Azure has now all the logic and all the knowledge to understand what needs to be done to make the platform look like you described it in your configuration file. So you instruct how the end result should look like, and Azure takes care of the rest, right? This is why we call this declarative. You describe what you want. And this is also much better compared to the imperative approach when it comes to documentation, because the declarative configuration files are actually your documented or your documentation files, let's say it like that. The code is your documentation, what you actually operate in the live platform. Now, a very important thing, I also showed that last week. When it comes to infrastructure as code, we need to think of the full life cycle. So what does that mean? That means that if you provision a new service, this is the first phase. That's normally not so complex because we have nothing. We have an empty Azure environment or an empty Azure resource group, and we deploy something new. It's brand new. So all the resources are created for the first time, right? Because nothing was there. And then the resources are sitting in that resource group, and they're actually now maybe live and used in production. But now comes the much more complex part, which means service maintenance. And that means that when the service was initially deployed, you go into the maintenance phase, which means the service might be extended. You might add additional components, additional services, or you might change configurations of the existing service, right? So this is a much more complex phase to actually manage. And then the very last is the service deactivation phase, which means the service is not used anymore, it's decommissioned, and this is also, or can also be done as code. And if we talk about infrastructure as code, we always should think about this full life cycle, because most of the people only cover the service provisioning phase, but not the two others. And it's very important to have this full life cycle in your head when thinking about the solution you actually want to develop. All right. Now let's have a look at ARM templates. So what is this actually now all about? Before we talk about ARM templates, it's important to understand this ARM term. So ARM stands for Azure Resource Manager. And this is something that obviously lives on the Azure platform. It's a service that works under the covers, and this service ensures that you have a consistent management experience across the board. Now, what does that mean? Imagine using Azure. There's lots of different tools you can use to work with the Azure platform. So you can use the Azure portal, you can use Azure PowerShell modules, you can use the Azure CLI if you want, you can use Azure DevOps to talk to the Azure platform, you can use the REST APIs to talk to Azure, and so on. So there's lots of different possibilities to talk to the Azure platform. But no matter what tools you use, no matter what approach you use, it will always be the Azure Resource Manager that handles your requests under the covers. And it ensures that your experience using Azure is always the same and it's consistent across the board. So no matter if you use the Azure portal, the Azure CLI, PowerShell scripts, or the REST APIs, you will always have the same permissions, the same policies will be active, and so on. So it's absolutely consistent. So it's a very, very important service that lives in Azure that does all the hard work for you. And one special thing that this service accepts is ARM templates. So as you can see here, if we use the Azure portal to talk to the Azure Resource Manager, it's obviously a more manual process. So we go to the portal and we use our mouse to configure something. So it's a more manual approach. If we use PowerShell scripts, this is an imperative approach. So we could write an imperative script using the PowerShell modules for Azure to deploy something or to maintain something. And then this specific or special approach is then ARM templates, because this gives us the declarative approach to describe our services, hand those over to the Azure Resource Manager, and Azure Resource Manager will actually analyze the environment and understands exactly what needs to be done to make the environment look like the way we described it in our configuration files. All right. If we have a little bit of a closer look into this Azure Resource Manager, I think this is very important to understand, not only to understand ARM templates, but also to understand how Azure works under the covers. A very important element that lives in Azure are the so-called resource providers. So in every Azure environment, or in every subscription, to be more precise, you have resource providers. And I just picked 3 of them. Actually, there's many, many more. But let's pick Microsoft Compute, so this resource provider. What this resource provider does, it's responsible to manage certain Azure resources. All right, and the Microsoft Compute provider, for instance, is responsible to manage virtual machine resources, or disk resources, or availability sets resources, or scale set resources, and so on. This is all related to Microsoft Compute, whereas the Microsoft Storage resource provider is obviously somehow responsible for the storage account resource type. And then to actually talk to the different resources, the resource provider has several resource provider operations at hand that it can use. So for instance, it can read an object, or it can write an object, or it can trigger a specific action on an object, and so on. So this is what happens under the covers. So everything is managed by the resource providers. And now to talk to all of these 150 plus resource providers from the outside world or from any application, we have this consistent management layer that is sitting in front of all of these resource providers, which is the Azure Resource Manager. So this is our endpoint to talk to the Azure platform. And as I already mentioned, no matter if you use the Azure portal to manage something, no matter if you use an ARM template, this is a screenshot of an ARM template, by the way, no matter if you use a PowerShell script, the endpoint we talk to is normally always the Azure Resource Manager. And then Azure Resource Manager will talk to the different resource providers to whatever provision or manage or delete your resources in the backend. So this is a very, I guess, very important slide to understand how Azure works under the covers. All right, now let's jump into ARM templates. we now know an ARM template is there to describe our service or our application that we want to provision or we want to manage in our Azure platform. And an ARM template is nothing but, well, I wouldn't say a simple JSON file, but let's say a JSON file. So using JSON files, we can now start describing our service. And you can see here a screenshot of the, well, it's an ARM template skeleton that is now still empty. And you can see there are several sections in there. And for now, you don't need to understand all of them. I think the most important ones are definitely the resources section, because inside the resources section, so in this array up here, you will describe all the Azure resources you want to deploy and you want to manage, right? So all the resources go there. If you want to deploy a virtual machine, you will have some code in this section. And that section will then contain like the name of the virtual machine, the size of the virtual machine, the operating system, and so on, right? And then the second area I want to cover today is the parameter section. Because what we want to do is we want to create and write code that we can use together with parameter values. So we don't want to have any hard-coded values, such as a virtual machine name or a virtual machine size inside our code, but we want to use parameters that we can use to be much more flexible, to parameterize our deployment. Which means if I use my code to deploy an application today, I might then submit some VM name and some VM size. And if I deploy another virtual machine tomorrow, I might use another VM name and another VM size, but I want to use the exact same code to deploy the virtual machine. And this is when parameters come into play that will add much flexibility to my deployment procedure. Good, then you can see there's some other sections. I will today not go into these. For now, it's important that you understand resources and the parameters. This is also what I will show you in the demos afterwards. Good, now what you can also see, I specifically mentioned an ARM template can be one or more JSON files. So the simplest approach to use ARM templates to deploy some service is to have all the resources your service needs to be deployed, to have them in one single file. But when you get a little bit more experienced later, you will find out that this might not be a very good approach because it doesn't scale. You don't have reusable code. And if you actually want to achieve these goals as well, you might want to somehow fan out your code into multiple files. So just to let you know, there's a very simple approach with having just one JSON file that contains all the resources for your application. But there's other approaches that allow you to fan out into multiple files, which also, of course, makes the whole procedure a little bit more complex, but it gives you the reusability of your code. So this is definitely better when you use multiple files. But today I will just cover single files. All right, now when you deploy a JSON file, you obviously have some resources described in there. And it's very important to understand that there's several deployment scopes you can use to apply your ARM template. Now, what does that mean? I mean, these bullet descriptions or names, I hope they sound familiar. So you're familiar with resource groups, subscriptions, management groups, and tenant. And all of these four levels in the resources hierarchy or the tenant hierarchy can be used to deploy ARM templates. Now, today I will focus on resource group based deployments, because these are the types of deployments you use to actually deploy resources, such as a virtual machine or a virtual network or an Azure firewall or something. The others are used for other things, because you know that all resources in Azure live inside a resource group, and that means that whenever you need to provision a resource, you need to have a resource group deployment. But let's say you want to write code to actually deploy a new resource group, then you cannot have a resource group deployment. In that case, you could create a subscription level deployment that creates a resource group or multiple resource groups for you first. And then after those have been created, you could deploy at the resource group level and then deploy your actual resources inside your newly created resource group. So today we'll focus on resource group level deployments, but just keep in mind that there's other levels you can deploy your ARM templates to as well. Good, now imagine you have your ARM template ready. You created your code, and I will guide you through the process afterwards, step by step. But imagine you have your code ready now. Now the question is, how can you hand over this code to the Azure platform or to the Azure Resource Manager? How does that work? Again, there are several ways to actually do this. The very simplest way is to use the Azure portal. So inside the Azure portal, you can bring your ARM templates and deploy them from there. But that's an additional manual process that maybe you want to avoid. Let's say you have your JSON files on your notebook, then you could also, of course, use PowerShell or the Azure CLI to directly hand over your JSON files to the Azure Resource Manager. That's actually normally how we do it in demos or in, let's say, in test environments. If we go in a production environment, there's of course some more advanced approaches, but today I will focus on the Azure CLI-based approach because this is like my favorite tool to do things. But as I said, you can also use PowerShell if you feel more comfortable with that. Now, one thing that's new and that's also critical to understand is the so-called what-if mode. And what does that mean? Imagine you have an application that is running in production, and now you need to make a configuration change on this existing application. That means you go back to your code, you change something, and now you apply this code to the platform. And because you're touching a production system, it would be good if you can first somehow verify what your code will exactly do, so that you know, okay, let's quickly double check what would this code do before I actually deploy it. And this can be done now, and that's like a new addition to this ARM templates story, which is very, very valuable. And it's just called what if. So what if I would deploy this template now to the platform? What would actually happen? And then what if will give me the results back and will tell me, look, I will create this and this resource brand new, or I will make these and these changes. And if you're happy with the what if results, you can then accept and proceed and actually make your deployment and your configuration change. But this is kind of a safety net that shows you what would actually change if you would deploy your code to the production platform. All right, so lots of talking. Now let's get into the demo here. So you can see how this looks like in the real world. So I want to first show you my Azure subscription. As you can see, I just prepared well, a single resource group here, which is called live stream. And this is totally empty. So there's nothing in there. Let's quickly refresh this. Where is it? All right, so we let it load in the background, but it's just an empty resource group. So there's nothing in there. All right, and now let's say I want to, yeah, now it's there. So let's quickly open that. And you can see there's no resources living in there. It's just an empty resource group. All right. Now we want to start creating a new ARM template. And for that, you can use, well, the editor of choice or of your choice. Mine is definitely Visual Studio Code. So let's bring that up and bring it up here. There we go. And you can see I just created a folder which is called live demo, and this is empty for now. So I don't have anything prepared, and I now start creating a new ARM template from scratch. So I just create a new file here, and you can name it, well, you can give it any name you want, and just name it well, demo.json, and this will create a new JSON file for me. Now you have seen in the slides that I had this skeleton ready, And because I added one of the extensions of Visual Studio Code, I can now easily populate this template with an ARM skeleton. So you could, of course, also simply copy and paste, but this is the ARM template skeleton that I'm using. It's totally empty for now. And in this first demo, I want to just create one single resource that I want to deploy using an ARM template. So that means for now, just go into the resource section. You can see based on these square brackets, this is an array, so this can hold one or multiple resources. And I will now just add one resource. And again, I get some IntelliSense-like help here. And I will just add a storage account for now. So I'll scroll down to ARM storage, and this gives me like a very basic code block to deploy a storage account. All right. Now, what do we see here? So it added one single object in here. So this is our storage account. And what you can see here first is the type. So we need to instruct the Azure Resource Manager once we submit this template, what type of object we want. And here you can see this notation of Microsoft.storage, which is the resource provider name, and then storage accounts, which is the resource type that is managed by this resource provider. So we obviously want to create or manage a storage account here. Now, what you can also see here, and this is an important one, is the API version. Remember, we have several different resource providers that the Azure Resource Manager actually uses. One of them is the Azure Storage Resource Provider. And every resource provider also has different API versions that he's offering, right? Now, to understand those a little bit better, let me quickly go to the ARM templates reference that you can find on the internet. So if you just Google for ARM template reference here, you will come straight to this link, Azure Resource Manager template reference, which gives you all the details how ARM templates actually work. And here in the reference, you can see all the different resource providers that are offered. And because we are now deploying a storage account, I will just scroll down to storage. There's also a filter or search field up here, but I will just browse down now. So there's, where is it? Scheduler storage, there it is. And if I just click all resources, I can now see after it's loaded, this is lagging a little bit. All right, you can now see, okay, I'm now in the Microsoft.storage resource provider documentation, and I can see the different resource types that this resource provider manages. One is storage accounts. This is the one we're interested now, but as you can see, there's much more than just the storage account itself. All right, but for now, we're just interested in the storage account. So now you can see that there are several different API versions to manage and to describe our storage account. So normally now when you start from scratch and create a new ARM template, you would normally go for the latest version of the API, which I do now. So I just go in here, click on that version of the API, and now I get the fully fledged code here. So I can see all the structure, how this resource provider API will accept your ARM template. And as you can see, this is much more code than in my example in Visual Studio Code, because in there, in this demo code block, it just added like the most important ones. So many of these properties here are not mandatory at all, so they're optional. And if you just don't submit a value, they're just ignored or they use kind of a default value. So if I scroll down a little bit, of course, I get all the details for all the different properties here. What they mean, if they're required or not, what values they accept, and so on. So this is all in the documentation. And this is very handy if you start with ARM templates and don't understand your code very well. So this is very, very helpful. All right, So this is type and API version. Now, normally what I do, this is just like my thing. I normally like to go top down. So I normally start my code with the type. So understand what type I want to deploy. Then I go to the API version, and then I define the name, because the storage account I want to deploy needs some name. And I just give it this name here, storage, and then some hopefully unique number. So just something. This will be the name of my storage account. Then tags, I'm not interested for now. I will just delete that code. Then, of course, I also have the location, right? And I normally put the location up here. And you can see this uses some function, but for now, I just remove that and I hard code this value because I want my storage account to be provisioned in the Western Europe region, which is Amsterdam. All right. And then the next property I use is the kind. There's several kinds of storage. So storage v1, v2, or blob storage only. I just use v2 here. And then I also have a SKU, which for now I go for this, which is premium LRS. Again, if I have no clue what SKU names are available, this would be in the documentation. It will tell me, look, this is what actually are valid values, premium LRS or standard LRS or something. And that's it. So with that code, Azure Resource Manager will know what I want to deploy, where I want to deploy it, and what the configuration of the storage account should look like. And so for now, just save this file. And then I want to now hand over this to the Azure Resource Manager. And as I told you, I could now copy this code and bring it to the portal, but I will use the Azure CLI to hand over this code. Now, you can see down here, I already opened the terminal and I navigated to my live demo folder. So if I do a dir here, I can just see my demo JSON file. So there's just one file in this folder. All right, good. Now, the Azure CLI is a CLI that you need to install first. So this is not available out of box on your notebook or on your development box. So you need to download it and install it. Once you have it, you have this AZ command that you can use that gives you a lot of options to actually manage your Azure platform. And one of the things you can do here is you can authenticate against the Azure platform. And once you're authenticated, create resources, manage resources, delete resources, or submit ARM templates. Now, in my case, I'm already logged in. So what you would normally do is this AC login, and then you would just submit your credentials. I have already done this, and I'm already connected to my subscription. So I will skip this part for now, and I will start right away with the deployment. And for that, I use this Azure CLI, the AZ command. I use this command, which is deployment. Oops. Deployment. And I want to do a resource group deployment. Remember, there's resource group deployments, subscription level deployments, tenant deployments, and so on. I want to do a resource group deployment here because I want to deploy my code into my resource group that I showed you in the very beginning. And then I need to define what I want to do with that deployment. In my case, I want to create a new deployment. So create a new resource group deployment. And now I need to submit two values. So the first is what resource group should this deployment go to? And I will pick the resource group I pre-created, which is named Livestream. And then the second is the code I now need to submit. And for this, I just use that parameter, which is template-file, and I submit my JSON file. So template-file, and the file I want to submit is my code up here, so my demo JSON file. And if I hit enter now, this would now create a new deployment. And if everything works as expected, this should deploy my code onto my Azure platform. So let's see if that works. While this is running, I'm already heading over to the Azure portal to see what happens there. And as you can see, if I refresh, I guess it's still empty. Yeah, because it takes a while to deploy and also takes another 15 to 20 seconds to appear here. But before this appears, I can already see it now because on every resource group, I have this menu here, which is called deployments. And on this menu, I can see all ARM template-based deployments. And here I can see, oh, there was a deployment. Obviously, it succeeded. I can see this is the deployment I just started. It took 23 seconds. Now I could also dive into the details of this deployment. So let's just dive in there to understand what happened. So I can see, well, did this work? What happened actually? And I can see, okay, there was a resource that has been deployed of type Microsoft.storage account. So no surprise to us. We know this is exactly what we had. And I could also have a look at the exact templates that was used in the deployment. And if I take a look at this, this is exactly the template I submitted using the Azure CLI. So no surprise for now. And if we now go back and see if the resource is there, it should appear now. And I can see, all right, the storage account appeared and it's deployed. So that's great. That obviously worked. If we go back to Visual Studio Code, I guess we should see, yep, that the output mentions, well, the provisioning state is now succeeded, and it gives me back some output, right? So the deployment obviously worked. Now, the good thing is if I do exactly the same again, so I again create a new resource group deployment into the same resource group with the exact same template file, I instruct Azure to, well, deploy this storage account. But now, because this is a declarative approach, and because Azure Resource Manager is smart, it will recognize, wait, there is already a storage account sitting there with that name in this location, in this specific resource group. And the configuration in your code did not change at all. And it will just analyze what needs to be changed to find out, well, there's nothing that needs to be changed because the code is still exactly the same. So now it didn't do anything. It didn't delete and recreate the storage account. It just recognized, well, I don't have to touch that storage account because it is exactly what your code says it should look like, right? So this is the initial provisioning part. But now let's think of this. Now imagine this storage account is now live and it's in production. And we now go back to our code because we need to make a configuration change. So I will now just add some code here to this already existing code. So I actually reuse the code block I already had, and I just add some configurations, which means please change the HTTPS traffic only setting to false. This would be not a very smart change, but I will just do it for demo purposes here. And also a setting that allows me to have like very large file shares inside my storage account. So these are two settings that I now just change afterwards. And now if I would just hit the same command again, it would just deploy it and it would recognize, well, these two settings are new and I need to change just those two settings. Now, this is a very simple example, but imagine you have a JSON file that you use to deploy 10 or 20 different resources with hundreds of lines of code. Then this might not be so obvious, right? And so we first want to understand, well, what would change if I would now apply this code on my Azure production platform? And for that, I can exactly use the same command I used, but I will just change the create command, remove that, and change it to what if. So that means I will still deploy something to a resource group, but I will not create a new deployment. I want to just understand what would change if I would deploy the same template into the same resource group. Now it tells me this is not good, so let's see what's wrong here. Obviously, I made a mistake. What's the problem there? This actually looks good to me. I missed something. Properties. That's strange. So let's see. Something is wrong with that code. All right. Change this. So let's quickly remove that. Apply it again. Yep, this works. Okay, that's strange. So now I just did the what if without any code change. This of course also works, but it's not well, it's not so exciting because of course it will just tell us, well, nothing changed. But just to get you like the result, so this will now tell me, well, there's no change because I will only touch this resource here, and there's no change. Now let's again check why this didn't work. So let's add again properties, right? And for now, just use this here. This should actually work. Not sure why it's not. Let's set this to false. Save, and now test it again. Yeah, now it's working. I don't know why. It was obviously a copy and paste error or something. But now it should give me back the information. Well, I would not recreate that storage account because it's already sitting there, but I would change this specific property. So let's see if that is true. Yeah, so there you can see now, resources to be modified are marked with this icon. I can see this would be modified now. So my storage account, STO98 something, and this property will change now from true to false. So this would be modified. And if I'm happy with that, I can now go back and fire my command and just change the what if to create again. And then this is done. Now it just applies and it will only change this specific setting. All right. So this works, and now we can continue from there. So we can now add new resources, add configurations of existing resources, and so on. But what we also want to quickly highlight now is that this code is very bad because all the values here, like the name and the location, are hard coded, right? And what we want to do is we want to now use parameters to actually parameterize our deployment. So for instance, what I could do is I could go to the parameter section and add a new parameter. And as you can see, I can give my parameter a name. So let's say it's storage account name or just name. Let's keep it simple. And that name is a string. So the data type of this parameter is a string, so it can be anything. And of course, you can add some additional information here, such as default values you want to use and so on. But for now, I just keep this simple and use the name, declare it as a string type parameter. But now I need to change my code saying, well, I now want to remove this hard-coded value here and instead use the value of the name parameter if I do the next deployment. And for that, I can use this function, which is called parameters. All right. And then I just pick my name parameter. Oops, I'm sorry for that. My name parameter there. So this means, well, the value of the name property should be the name property's value, right? So the parameter that this, the value that this parameter has should be used as the name or for the name of my storage account. And if I save this and I create a new deployment, so I use the exact same code. It now asks me, well, I need a name for your well, storage account or for the name parameter specifically. Please enter something. And if I do this, it will now accept that value and it will use it to create a new storage account with that specific name. The next time I run the same code, I can enter a different name and it will obviously provision a new storage account with that new name. And of course, I would now continue from there and change all my hard-coded values to parameters so that I'm super flexible with deploying new storage accounts in the future. So this is the parameters that ARM templates actually offer. All right. Now, of course, when you start creating ARM templates, I mean, there's tools that help you to create your code, such as Visual Studio Code with the appropriate extensions, but it's still pretty hard to create more complex ARM templates. And to help you there, there's again several approaches or procedures to get you up to speed a little bit. So I don't know many persons that really start creating ARM templates with a plain file that's totally empty, because this is lots of work. So you would normally use some code that is living somewhere that you can get from somewhere, and then just adjust the code to your specific needs. And I will quickly show you where you can get that code. So one very simple way to get code is to get it from the Azure portal, or more specifically from an already deployed resource. So for instance, if I go back to my portal here and I have this storage account deployed now, if I've done this manually, I can now just take this checkbox, and on the top right, I could say, please export a template for this specific resource I selected. And if I do this, this will now create an ARM template for me to deploy this storage account. So as you can see, this now looks familiar to you. The type is storage account. The API version is here. The location is there. There's some SKU section there. The kind is there, and then some additional settings as well. And that means that I can now just copy out this code, create a new JSON file from scratch, copy in or paste in this code, can adjust it a little bit, and then I have a very good start into my ARM template if I want to create an ARM template that I use to deploy a new storage account. So you don't have to start from zero. You can also deploy a resource from the Azure portal, configure it to your needs, and once you have it, you can export your ARM template from there. Just one thing here, keep in mind, and you can see it here as well, you need to clean this code a little bit, because it uses like very special parameter names that are not very meaningful, and some things just cannot be used by just copying pasting this. So you need to clean it up a little bit, but I would say normally if you just get out this code, you should be 80–90% there, and this saves you lots of time when it comes to creating ARM templates. All right, the second very valuable thing to get is the so-called Azure Quick Start templates. If you go your favorite search engine and you search for Azure Quick Start templates, you will see or find a GitHub repository, Azure Quick Start templates. And if you navigate to this, you'll find hundreds, I think it's hundreds of different templates that you can use for all the various Azure services. So just to pick an example, obviously this here, well, no, that's not a good example. Let's pick that. This seems to be an ARM template to deploy an Azure Bastion host resource. And if I think, well, this could be helpful to me, let's get in there. Then you have like a very good description, what this actually does. You have the files here, like such as the JSON file. I can open this and I can have a look at the code. I can copy out this code, reuse it, and so on. It's a best practice to just clone down the whole repository to your development box and use it from there. But you can also, of course, get out like simple fragments or single fragments. Or what you can also do to check if this really works and how it behaves, you can also directly deploy this to your Azure environment if you want. So this will just ask you for privileges to actually log into your Azure platform, and it will deploy the JSON file directly into your Azure environment. So this is a very, very helpful Git repository to start your ARM templates journey. And you will find very simple ARM templates and also super complex ones. Really go through, navigate, browse the different templates here, and these are super good to learn how Azure ARM templates actually work. All right. let's get back to the slideshow. So I hope this gave you some kickstart into ARM templates, how they work, how you can start creating ARM templates, and how you can actually submit them and hand them over to the Azure Resource Manager. There's, again, several different ways to do that. I just showed you one. But I encourage you to try out the different methods and see what works best for you. And please keep in mind, this is a very basic approach to deploy ARM templates. If you do this in an enterprise-grade environment, you would, of course, do this a little bit differently. But the way how you actually create ARM templates, how you hand them over, the basic principle is exactly the same. All right, so to close the session now, how can ARM templates actually help you to become, well, more successful, or to make sure that you can really master your Azure resources? Well, ARM templates are JSON files that follow a declarative infrastructure as code approach, which means it's great to actually initially provision new resources, but also maintain resources that are already deployed. So this gives you great flexibility because it really supports this full service lifecycle. And because it's a declarative approach, you can use your code as your service documentation too. I'm not saying that JSON files are super easy to read. It depends a little bit on how well trained you are reading JSON files. It's definitely not super easy, and depending on your application that you described, it can be very, very complex. But there's also helper tools that allows you to visualize your JSON code so that you can get a little bit of a better overview. All right. And the last thing I want to point out here is this new what if functionality that really gives you this additional safety net, so that you can understand what would change if you would deploy code over an already existing infrastructure, so that you can first analyze and see if the changes that what if tells you it would make, if this is really what you expect or not. And if it's not what you were expecting, you better go back to your code or to your live environment and analyze why, well, what if it gave you these results. So safety net, very important to have this. I really encourage you to use the what if function now. I showed you how this works in the Azure CLI. It also perfectly works with PowerShell, by the way, if you prefer to use that. And that said, I hope this gave you a good quick start into Azure ARM templates. I hope this was, well, understandable and gives you some guidance to start your own Azure ARM templates journey now. I have not seen the Q&A section yet. I will have a look now, but I assume Mirza already answered most of the questions. If there's still questions around, or if you have additional questions, feel free to throw them in the window now, and I will go through the questions that are still unanswered and see what you would like to know. That said, this session has been recorded. It will be put out on the YouTube channel and then also on LinkedIn. Well, I would say during tomorrow, so on Friday night, let's say Friday evening, it should be available, so that if you missed it or only could see parts of it, you can also enjoy the rest of the show. All right, that's it. Thanks very much for joining the live stream. Watch out for new live streams that I will announce very soon. And I'm looking forward to have you back in another live stream very, very soon. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.